The Kingdom of Kush, an ancient African civilization that once rivaled Egypt in power and prestige, remains largely forgotten to many in the Western world. However, its story is as crucial to understanding the broader history of Africa as any civilization in the Mediterranean or Near East. Situated to the south of Egypt, Kush rose from the heart of Africa, stretching across the Nile Valley and dominating the region for centuries. But before it became an empire known for its formidable kings and queens, the Kushites had to overcome not only internal challenges, but also external forces that would shape their destiny. The first chapter of this narrative is not one of grand battles or monumental conquests. Instead, it is the story of the fertile lands along the Nile River, the people who settled there, and the slow but steady rise of a kingdom that would later become one of the most powerful in the ancient world. At its core, the Kingdom of Kush's rise is about survival, adaptation, and the deep connection between people and land. The lush and abundant Nile Valley offered not only fertile soil for crops, but also a corridor through which cultures could mingle, trade, and, in time, conflict. The land of Kush was rich in natural resources, particularly gold, iron, and precious stones. These were not only valuable commodities for trade, but also symbols of wealth and power. The people of Kush, who lived in the regions now known as modern-day Sudan, began to establish settlements along the Nile, where they built villages that would eventually grow into cities. These early communities were heavily influenced by the powerful civilization to the north, Egypt. The Egyptians, with their advanced technology and wealth, exerted a profound influence on the Kushites. However, the relationship was not one of mere subjugation. Rather, it was a dynamic one, shaped by both trade and conflict. Kush's early interactions with Egypt were often peaceful, centered on trade. The Kushites, living in a land rich with natural resources, had much to offer their northern neighbors. Gold, for example, flowed from the mines in the Nubian desert into Egypt, fueling its economy and contributing to the pharaoh's image of divine wealth. The trade of ebony, ivory, and incense further strengthened the relationship between the two kingdoms. It was not uncommon for Egyptians to send expeditions to the lands of Kush, where they would trade goods, build alliances, and in some cases, even intermarry. These exchanges were vital to the growth of Kush and laid the foundation for the complex cultural ties that would define the region for centuries. Yet, despite the shared wealth and mutual dependence, the relationship between Egypt and Kush was not always harmonious. The growing power of Egypt, particularly during the New Kingdom period, began to cast a shadow over the smaller kingdom to the south. Egypt's rulers, who had long viewed themselves as the guardians of the Nile and its tributaries, began to look at Kush with a more imperialistic eye. While early interactions had been cordial, Egypt's expanding influence meant that the Kushites would eventually face a choice: submit to Egyptian domination or resist. The question of Kushite autonomy versus Egyptian domination would become a central theme in the region's history. Throughout the early centuries of the first millennium BCE, the relationship between Egypt and Kush oscillated between cooperation and rivalry. On one hand, Egypt needed Kush's resources. On the other, Kush began to grow more independent, emboldened by the riches of its land and the increasing power of its leaders. By the 10th century BCE, the seeds of conflict were sown. The rise of the Kushite dynasty, known as the 25th dynasty, would forever alter the course of history. But before these epic struggles could unfold, the people of Kush were quietly laying the foundations of their civilization. As settlements grew into cities, they began to develop their own distinct culture, one that was heavily influenced by the Egyptians, but also uniquely Kushite. Architecture, art, and religion flourished, with the Kushites building temples, pyramids, and palaces modeled after those of their northern neighbors, yet infused with their own regional styles and religious symbols. This blending of influences would become one of the defining features of Kushite civilization, as they took what they learned from Egypt and adapted it to their own needs and sensibilities. The early leaders of Kush were not yet the formidable kings and queens that history would later remember, but rather local chieftains and rulers who sought to unite the disparate tribes and clans of the region. These leaders, through diplomacy and warfare, began to consolidate power, establishing the first foundations of a unified kingdom. Their authority was reinforced by their control of the key trade routes that ran along the Nile, which allowed them to accumulate wealth and establish alliances with neighboring peoples. Yet, despite the growing influence of these early rulers, Kush remained a relatively small kingdom, its influence still confined to the southern reaches of the Nile. It was not until the rise of the Kingdom of Kush in its later stages that its true power began to emerge. The Kushites, having lived under the shadow of Egyptian dominance for centuries, would soon turn the tables. Through a series of astute political moves and military campaigns, the Kushites began to reclaim their independence. The eventual rise of a Kushite king who would challenge Egypt's supremacy would mark a turning point in the region's history. The king, whose name would be remembered for centuries, was Pi, the first ruler of the 25th dynasty. Pi's ascent was not a sudden event. Rather, it was the culmination of years of strategic maneuvering and consolidation. His kingdom, though still smaller than Egypt, was emerging as a regional power in its own right. The foundation of Pi's rise lay in the growing strength of the Kingdom of Kush and the increasing instability of Egypt. Egypt, under the rule of the Libyan pharaohs, was in a period of decline, with internal strife and fragmentation threatening the unity of the nation. Pi, seeing an opportunity, gathered an army and marched north to restore order to Egypt, claiming the title of pharaoh and solidifying Kush's role as the dominant power in the region. But this was not merely an act of conquest. Pi's victory was a symbolic one, as it represented the triumph of Kushite strength and independence over Egyptian dominance. For the first time in centuries, the people of Kush were in control, and their kings would sit on the throne of Egypt. This moment marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the Kingdom of Kush would not only survive but thrive. The Kushites' triumph over Egypt was not the result of a single battle or military campaign, but rather the culmination of centuries of preparation and adaptation. From their early days as traders and settlers along the Nile, to the consolidation of power by local rulers, to the strategic brilliance of Pi, the Kushites had laid the groundwork for their eventual rise. It was a story of gradual development, of a civilization that, though small and often overlooked, had the resilience and vision to take its place at the center of African and Mediterranean history. As the chapter draws to a close, it becomes clear that the Kingdom of Kush's rise was not an isolated event, but part of a broader pattern of regional dynamics that stretched across the ancient world. The interaction between Egypt and Kush was a story of both collaboration and competition, of two civilizations that would shape one another in ways both subtle and profound. But above all, it is the story of a kingdom that, against all odds, rose from the banks of the Nile to become a mighty force in its own right, forever altering the course of African history. In the early centuries of the first millennium BCE, the Kingdom of Kush stood at the crossroads of two worlds, the fertile heart of Africa and the ancient, prosperous civilization of Egypt to the north. It was a time of transformation, where the once small and largely inconspicuous Kingdom of Kush began to flex its muscles and forge a new identity. The story of this transformation is one of ambition, resilience, and a complex interplay between cultural influence and political power. Kush's journey was neither swift nor easy, but its eventual emergence as a rival to Egypt was the result of carefully laid plans, external pressures, and a deep-seated desire for independence. At this point in history, the Kingdom of Kush was not just an isolated polity, but part of a broader network of kingdoms and tribes stretching across the vast stretches of northeast Africa. The kingdom's inhabitants had already established sophisticated systems of governance and culture long before they would come to be seen as Egypt's counterparts. Yet despite their early advances, they still existed under the long shadow of Egypt's overwhelming power and influence. Egypt, once again on the rise after centuries of fragmentation, looked to assert its dominance over the Nile and beyond. For Kush, this was a double-edged sword. While the Egyptians were a source of both knowledge and trade, they also represented an unyielding, external force that had the potential to threaten Kushite sovereignty. During this period, the relationship between Egypt and Kush was at a tipping point. The previous chapters of their shared history had been dominated by trade and cultural exchange. The Kushites, especially in the southern reaches of the Nile, provided Egypt with valuable commodities, gold, ivory, and exotic goods that fueled Egypt's economy and were essential to its courtly splendor. However, this arrangement also made the Kushites vulnerable. Egypt's control over the northern Nile had allowed the pharaohs to maintain a powerful monopoly over trade routes, creating a delicate balance of power that often tipped in favor of Egypt. As Egypt's political landscape became more volatile and fragmented, however, this imbalance began to shift. In the 10th century BCE, Egypt was in a state of turmoil. The previous dynasties had left Egypt fragmented, with a series of rival kingdoms and factions vying for control. The power vacuum in Egypt created a moment of opportunity for Kush. Kushite rulers had long eyed the situation in Egypt, watching closely for signs of weakness. The Egyptians, who had once viewed the Kushites as subjects, now faced internal strife and instability. The time had come for the Kushites to assert themselves in ways they had not done before. The ruler who would spearhead Kush's rise to power was Pi, a man whose name would resonate throughout both Kushite and Egyptian history. Pi was not simply a military leader. He was a visionary, deeply aware of the changing tides in Egypt and eager to take advantage of the opening that was before him. Pi's reign marked the beginning of what would come to be known as the 25th dynasty of Egypt, a period during which Kush would not only rival Egypt, but would come to rule it. But this was no simple conquest. Pi's ambition was not driven by a desire for mere territorial expansion or plunder. His was a political mission, the reclamation of the glory and power that Egypt once held, and the restoration of order in the region. To understand the significance of Pi's actions, it is essential to look at the state of Egypt at the time. Egypt, after years of instability, had fractured into several smaller kingdoms, each one struggling to assert its control over the ancient land. The Libyan pharaohs, who had ruled Egypt for several generations, had proven themselves incapable of uniting the country. As Egypt fractured, its once great power dwindled, leaving it vulnerable to outside forces. Pi saw this as a crucial opportunity. Pi's journey north, from the Kingdom of Kush to Egypt, was not an act of blind ambition, but a strategic campaign. Pi did not simply march to Egypt with a vast army to destroy his enemies. He came as a liberator. He sought to restore the Egyptian monarchy, but on his terms. In doing so, he would simultaneously assert Kushite dominance and lay claim to the title of pharaoh. This was a calculated move, for Pi knew that the legacy of Egypt would lend legitimacy to his rule and solidify his position as the region's most powerful leader. To claim Egypt's throne was to claim the mantle of Egypt's long history of grandeur, and Pi's effort to do so would make him one of the most significant figures in the ancient world. When Pi arrived in Egypt, his forces were not met with immediate resistance. The fragmented nature of Egypt at the time meant that no unified force could stand against him. Rather than seeking to conquer Egypt by brute force, Pi approached the situation with a sense of diplomacy. His campaign was as much about uniting Egypt's fractured factions as it was about asserting Kushite dominance. Through a series of carefully executed military maneuvers and alliances, Pi gained control of key Egyptian cities. His forces swept through Upper Egypt, the heart of the country's power base, and eventually he found himself at the gates of the city of Thebes, the historic capital of Egypt's pharaohs. It was in Thebes that Pi's victory was secured. The conquest of Thebes, however, was not simply a military triumph. It was a symbolic one. Thebes had long been seen as the spiritual and political center of Egypt, and to capture it was to claim Egypt's soul. Pi's success was not only marked by military superiority, but also by his ability to present himself as the legitimate heir to Egypt's pharaonic tradition. He was not merely a foreign conqueror. He positioned himself as the rightful ruler of both Kush and Egypt. His military campaign culminated in his coronation as Pharaoh of Egypt, an event that forever altered the trajectory of both civilizations. Pi's rule was not just about military conquest. It was about consolidation. His reign saw the re-establishment of central authority in Egypt, a land long fractured by internal divisions. He sought to restore Egypt's ancient glory, but now with Kushite influence woven into its fabric. In the decades that followed, Pi and his successors would continue to rule Egypt from the southern Nile, overseeing a dynasty that blended Kushite and Egyptian traditions, art, and religion. This fusion of cultures became one of the defining features of the 25th dynasty. The significance of Pi's reign goes beyond the military triumphs and political maneuvering. His victory represented a profound shift in the balance of power between Kush and Egypt. It marked the moment when the Kingdom of Kush, once seen as a tributary state, emerged as a dominant force in the ancient world. This was a triumph of resilience, vision, and careful calculation. Pi's success signaled to the world that Kush was no longer a peripheral kingdom, but a central player in the political and cultural dynamics of the Nile Valley. In the aftermath of Pi's conquest, Egypt experienced a brief period of stability. The Kushite pharaohs of the 25th dynasty ruled over a united Egypt, but their influence was not without challenges. The restored power of Egypt, under Kushite rule, was still viewed with suspicion by many, both within Egypt and beyond. The legacy of the 25th dynasty, however, would continue to echo through history. Pi's reign would be remembered not only as a time of political consolidation, but as the moment when the Kingdom of Kush stepped into the global stage as a major power. The rise of Kush under Pi was the beginning of a new chapter for both Kush and Egypt. Pi's success was the result of generations of consolidation, trade, and careful political maneuvering. His conquest of Egypt was the culmination of a long and slow rise, but it was also the beginning of Kush's golden age. Under the 25th dynasty, Kush would continue to leave an indelible mark on both the Nile Valley and the wider world, shaping the future of the region for centuries to come. The triumph of Pi and the rise of the 25th dynasty marked a defining moment in the history of both Kush and Egypt. However, Pi's victory was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a complex and delicate process of integration, adaptation, and rule that would shape the future of the region. The days following Pi's coronation as pharaoh of Egypt would bring new challenges, not just for the Kingdom of Kush, but for the delicate relationship between Kush and Egypt. While Pi had successfully asserted Kushite dominance, it was his successors who would face the task of consolidating and maintaining that power. The political landscape of the Nile Valley, though united under Kushite rule, was fraught with internal strife, external pressures, and the ever-present shadow of Egypt's previous glory. In the years following Pi's death, his son Shabaka ascended to the throne of both Kush and Egypt. Shabaka, like his father, understood the complexities of ruling over such a vast and diverse land. The challenges he faced were immense, as he sought to solidify the position of the 25th dynasty and secure the legacy of the Kushite kings in both Egypt and Nubia. However, Shabaka's reign was marked not by conquest, but by a commitment to restoring the cultural and religious unity of Egypt, which had been fractured by years of foreign rule and internal instability. His goal was not merely to govern, but to restore the spiritual essence of Egypt, which had been lost during the period of foreign domination. To do this, Shabaka sought to re-establish the ancient traditions that had once made Egypt a powerful and revered civilization. One of Shabaka's most notable achievements was his restoration of the ancient religious practices that had once been the cornerstone of Egypt's identity. He understood that the strength of Egypt lay not just in its military or political power, but in its ability to inspire devotion and unity through its religious and cultural institutions. Shabaka said about restoring the temples and sanctuaries that had fallen into ruin, and he placed a heavy emphasis on reviving the priesthoods that had once held great influence over Egyptian society. By aligning himself with the religious elite, Shabaka was able to solidify his legitimacy and strengthen his rule. His efforts to reinvigorate the spiritual life of Egypt were not only a political strategy, but also a symbolic gesture of continuity and cultural pride. At the same time, Shabaka's reign saw the deepening of Kushite influence over Egypt. While Pi had been seen as a liberator, Shabaka was a ruler who sought to blend the two cultures, Kushite and Egyptian, into a unified whole. The Kushites, under Shabaka's leadership, adopted many of the symbols, traditions, and practices of Egyptian culture, but they also brought their own distinctive identity into the mix. This fusion of Kushite and Egyptian culture was evident in the art, architecture, and even the language of the time. Shabaka's reign became a period of cultural synthesis, in which the two civilizations coexisted and mutually influenced one another. It was a time when the grandeur of Egypt was once again matched by the strength of Kush, and together they formed a powerful and harmonious empire. However, the process of blending these two cultures was not without its difficulties. While many Egyptians accepted the Kushite rulers as legitimate pharaohs, there was still a sense of resistance among certain segments of Egyptian society. The Egyptians, who had long been proud of their own ancient traditions, found it difficult to fully embrace the rule of a foreign power, even one that had restored their kingdom to its former glory. In particular, the priesthoods, who had held significant sway over Egypt's religious and political affairs, often found themselves at odds with the Kushite rulers. Shabaka, in his efforts to restore Egypt's religious heritage, had to navigate the delicate balance of appeasing these powerful institutions while also asserting his authority as the ruler of both Kush and Egypt. This tension between the Kushite kings and the Egyptian elites was a recurring theme throughout the 25th dynasty. Despite their cultural and religious efforts to unite Egypt and Kush, the Kushite rulers were never fully accepted by all Egyptians. The long-standing rivalry between the two cultures could not be easily overcome, and while the Kushite kings were able to maintain control over Egypt for several generations, they were constantly confronted with challenges to their rule. These challenges came not only from within Egypt, but from external forces as well, as the Assyrian Empire to the northeast began to rise in power, threatening the stability of the entire region. The Assyrians, under their king Tiglath-Pileser III, began to make aggressive moves against the kingdoms of the Near East and the Nile Valley. Their military campaigns reached as far as Egypt, where they sought to expand their empire and extend their influence over the region. The Kushite rulers, who had already consolidated their power in Egypt, now faced the daunting prospect of defending their newly acquired kingdom against a formidable and technologically advanced enemy. The rise of the Assyrian Empire marked the beginning of a new phase in the history of Kush and Egypt, one that would challenge the strength and unity of the 25th dynasty. Shabaka's successor, Shabataka, would face the full brunt of the Assyrian threat. The Assyrians, recognizing the vulnerability of Egypt and Kush, launched a series of military campaigns aimed at toppling the Kushite rulers and asserting their dominance over the Nile Valley. The Assyrians' superior military technology, including their use of iron weapons and siege warfare, gave them a decisive advantage over the Kushites. Despite their best efforts, the Kushite kings were unable to withstand the full force of the Assyrian onslaught. In 674 BCE, Shabataka was defeated by the Assyrian king Esarhaddon, who successfully captured Egypt and placed it under Assyrian control. The defeat of Shabataka marked the end of the 25th dynasty's rule over Egypt. The Kushite kings were forced to retreat back to their homeland in Nubia, where they would continue to rule their kingdom, but the glory days of their reign over Egypt had come to an end. The Assyrian conquest of Egypt dealt a significant blow to Kushite power and influence, but it also marked a new chapter in the history of the Nile Valley. The 25th dynasty's legacy, however, was not easily erased. Despite their eventual defeat, the Kushite kings left an indelible mark on both Egypt and Kush, shaping the cultural and political landscape of the region for centuries to come. The story of the 25th dynasty is one of ambition, resilience, and cultural fusion. Under the rule of Pi, Shabaka, and their successors, Kush rose to become a major power in the ancient world, asserting its dominance over Egypt and leaving behind a legacy that would echo through the ages. The Kushite rulers sought not only to govern, but to restore the grandeur of Egypt, blending the best elements of both civilizations into a unified whole. Though their reign was ultimately short-lived, the cultural and political achievements of the 25th dynasty left an enduring impact on the region, reminding the world of the strength and significance of the Kingdom of Kush. The fall of the 25th dynasty marked the end of Kushite rule over Egypt, but did not signal the end of the Kingdom of Kush itself. Despite the defeat by the Assyrians and the retreat of the Kushite kings back to their homeland in Nubia, the Kingdom of Kush remained a formidable power in northeastern Africa. The end of the 25th dynasty left a profound impact on both Egypt and Kush, but the Kushites, ever resilient, now faced the challenge of reasserting their identity and maintaining their kingdom in the face of both internal and external challenges. Kush had long been a land of great wealth and natural resources, situated strategically along the Nile River, which allowed it to control important trade routes between Central Africa and Egypt. Its fertile lands produced abundant crops, while its gold mines and other valuable resources made it a rich and powerful kingdom. Yet, despite its natural wealth, the fall of the 25th dynasty exposed the vulnerabilities of the kingdom. The Assyrians had not only defeated the Kushite forces, but had also displaced them from Egypt, effectively ending the Kushite dream of ruling both lands. The political and military setback was significant, but it did not mark the end of the kingdom's significance. Instead, it led to a reconfiguration of Kush's role in the region. After the retreat of the Kushite kings, the Kingdom of Kush entered into a period of self-reflection and reinvention. The loss of Egypt was a blow, but the Kushites were determined to preserve their identity and re-establish their power within their own borders. The power vacuum left by the Assyrians in Egypt also opened the door for the Kushites to reclaim their position as regional leaders. However, the road to recovery would be neither simple nor swift. The Kushites had to rebuild their strength, reorganize their political structure, and adapt to new realities. One of the significant factors that helped Kush maintain its independence was its relationship with its neighboring regions, particularly the Nubian tribes and peoples to the south. Kush had long been a central hub for trade, and the wealth generated through its trading routes was crucial in sustaining the kingdom during this period of rebuilding. The Kushites had strong ties with other African kingdoms and peoples, many of whom shared cultural and linguistic similarities with them. These connections allowed Kush to maintain its cultural identity even as it dealt with the fallout of its defeat by the Assyrians. Over time, the kingdom's rulers shifted their focus inward. They concentrated on fortifying their territories, re-establishing control over vital resources, and rebuilding their political institutions. The kings of Kush were keenly aware of the need to preserve the legacy of the 25th dynasty while also carving out a new future for their kingdom. This period of reinvention was marked by a renewed emphasis on religion, culture, and governance. The Kushites, ever proud of their ancient heritage, sought to solidify their standing as the custodians of the Nile Valley's rich cultural and religious traditions. They were determined to carry forward the religious practices that had been established during the height of their power in Egypt, ensuring that their legacy would not be forgotten. In this period of recovery, the Kushite kings sought to strengthen their ties with Egypt's powerful neighbors and other foreign powers. While Egypt was no longer under Kushite control, the kingdom remained a vital player in the politics of the Nile Valley and beyond. The Assyrians, having conquered Egypt, sought to extend their influence further into Africa. However, their efforts to assert control over Kush met with resistance. The Kushite kings, particularly those of the later periods, were keenly aware of the need to defend their territory from foreign invaders, and they employed military strategies to guard against any external threats. At the same time, they used diplomacy and alliances to maintain their power and protect their interests. The period following the loss of Egypt saw the rise of new dynastic rulers in Kush, particularly the so-called Napata dynasty, named after the city of Napata in northern Sudan, which became the center of Kushite power. Napata would eventually become the capital of the kingdom and a symbol of its resurgence. The rise of Napata as the political and religious heart of Kush signified the beginning of a new era for the kingdom. It was here that the kings of Kush would begin to build the foundations of their future power, both in terms of political control and military might. As the Kushites sought to reassert their dominance in the Nile Valley, they turned to their rich cultural heritage as a source of strength. The Kushite kings were keenly aware of the symbolism of the Egyptian monarchy and sought to incorporate many aspects of Egyptian culture into their own rule. While they no longer controlled Egypt itself, the Kushites maintained the traditions and practices of the pharaohs, and their rulers took on the titles and symbols of the Egyptian kings. The Kushite pharaohs, once seen as outsiders in Egypt, now embraced the symbols of power that had long been associated with the pharaohs. Their ability to blend both Kushite and Egyptian traditions was a testament to the resilience of their culture and their capacity to adapt to changing circumstances. In addition to their cultural revival, the Kushite kings also focused on rebuilding the kingdom's military strength. They re-established the warrior culture that had once made them formidable opponents in battle, particularly against Egypt's enemies. The army of Kush was reorganized, with an emphasis on training and discipline. The military became a symbol of the kingdom's renewed strength and determination to safeguard its sovereignty. The Kushites were particularly adept at utilizing their knowledge of the terrain and their strategic position along the Nile River, which allowed them to launch effective campaigns against potential invaders. As the kingdom's military strength grew, so too did its influence. Kush began to reclaim its status as a regional power, although its power was now more localized than it had been during the 25th dynasty. The kings of Kush engaged in diplomatic missions with other African kingdoms, strengthening their ties with neighboring states and further solidifying their influence in the region. The kingdom's wealth and resources allowed it to maintain a powerful position in the trade networks that spanned Africa, and Kush remained a critical player in the politics of the ancient world. The shift in focus from Egypt to the internal consolidation of power in Kush did not mean the kingdom had abandoned its ambitions entirely. The Kushites, though no longer rulers of Egypt, continued to harbor aspirations of reclaiming their former dominion. As the Assyrian Empire began to weaken in the face of its own internal problems, the Kushites saw an opportunity to expand their influence once again. Though they never fully regained control over Egypt, they remained a significant force in the region, and their influence continued to shape the history of northeastern Africa. In the centuries that followed the retreat of the 25th dynasty, the Kingdom of Kush would undergo further transformations. The rise of the city of Meroë as the new capital of the kingdom would mark the next phase in Kushite history. Meroë, located further to the south, became the seat of power for the later Kushite rulers, and its strategic location allowed it to become a thriving center of trade, culture, and military might. The Kushite kings of Meroë would continue to rule with the same resilience and determination that had characterized their predecessors, adapting to changing circumstances while maintaining their sense of cultural identity. Through all these shifts, the Kingdom of Kush continued to be a beacon of strength and cultural continuity in Africa, drawing on its rich heritage while also adapting to the challenges of the ancient world. The loss of Egypt did not signal the end of Kush's greatness. Rather, it marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the Kushites would demonstrate their enduring resilience, their ability to adapt, and their unwavering commitment to their legacy. The Kingdom of Kush had endured its share of triumphs and setbacks, but with the fall of the 25th dynasty and the subsequent retreat of its rulers from Egypt, the Kushite people were forced to reevaluate their position in the broader historical context. Although the Assyrian conquest had brought an end to their rule over Egypt, it did not erase the legacy of the Kushites. In the years following the defeat, the Kingdom of Kush reasserted itself as a regional power, focusing on its internal growth and the rebuilding of its identity. It was during this period of reinvention that the Kushites made one of their most important shifts, the relocation of their capital to Meroë, a move that would eventually change the course of their history and solidify their place as one of the greatest civilizations of the ancient world. Meroë, located further south of their traditional heartlands near the Nile River, was to become the new political, military, and cultural center of the Kingdom of Kush. The decision to move the capital from Napata to Meroë was not merely an arbitrary one. It was driven by both practical and strategic considerations. First, the location of Meroë was more defensible than Napata, offering the Kushites better protection against potential invasions from the north, particularly from the Assyrians, who had wreaked havoc in Egypt and had their eyes on the entire Nile Valley. The new capital was positioned near rich deposits of iron, ore, and other natural resources, providing the kingdom with the economic foundation necessary to rebuild its strength. Furthermore, Meroë's location along important trade routes opened up new avenues for commerce, allowing the Kushites to tap into the broader trade networks of Africa and the Mediterranean world. Meroë quickly became a thriving city, known for its impressive architecture, sophisticated governance, and vibrant cultural life. It was here that the Kushites began to forge their future, drawing from both their ancient Egyptian heritage and their own unique traditions. The architectural landscape of Meroë was particularly notable, with the construction of large temples, palaces, and pyramids that reflected both Egyptian influence and the distinct Kushite style. The Meroitic pyramids, which were smaller but more numerous than those of Egypt, became a hallmark of Kushite art and a symbol of the kingdom's resurgence. The Kushites, much like their Egyptian counterparts, believed in the divine nature of their rulers, and the construction of these grand monuments was a testament to their enduring reverence for their kings and queens. One of the most significant aspects of the shift to Meroë was the consolidation of political power in the hands of the Kushite kings and queens. The move to Meroë allowed the Kushite rulers to assert greater control over their territory, unifying their kingdom under a centralized authority. The kings of Meroë were both political and military leaders, wielding power over a vast and diverse population that included not only native Kushites, but also a variety of other African peoples who lived within the kingdom's borders. The rulers of Meroë were not content to simply rest on the laurels of their past victories. They sought to expand their influence and solidify their dominance in the region. Under their leadership, Kush entered a new phase of military and economic growth. The Kushite kings of Meroë were keenly aware of the importance of trade in securing their kingdom's prosperity. Meroë became a major hub for trade, linking Africa to the Mediterranean and the Near East. The kingdom's location along the Nile River allowed it to maintain control over key trade routes that connected the interior of Africa to the ancient world. The Kushites were skilled traders, dealing in gold, ivory, ebony, and other luxury goods that were highly sought after by neighboring civilizations. The kingdom's wealth from trade enabled it to maintain a powerful military and to fund large-scale construction projects, which in turn reinforced the authority of the king and bolstered the status of Meroë as a symbol of Kushite strength. During this period of prosperity, the Kingdom of Kush experienced a remarkable cultural and artistic renaissance. The rulers of Meroë were not only interested in expanding their empire and securing their wealth, they were also passionate patrons of the arts, commissioning works of sculpture, pottery, and jewelry that reflected the unique fusion of Kushite and Egyptian styles. This period saw the development of the Meroitic script, a written language that was distinct from Egyptian hieroglyphs but shared some of the same cultural underpinnings. The Meroitic script was used for official inscriptions, religious texts, and monumental stele, marking the kingdom's embrace of its identity as a powerful civilization with a rich cultural legacy. The artistic achievements of the Kushites during this period were not limited to sculpture and writing. The kingdom also made great strides in the fields of metallurgy and ironworking. Meroë became renowned for its iron production, and the Kushites established themselves as master metalworkers. The iron produced in Meroë was used not only for tools and weapons, but also for trade, as it was highly valued throughout Africa and the Mediterranean. The iron industry became a cornerstone of the kingdom's economy, fueling its military expansion and allowing it to maintain its dominance in the region. The strength of the Meroitic kingdom was not only defined by its military and economic might, but also by its religious and ideological foundation. The Kushites continued to follow many of the religious practices that had been established during the reign of the 25th dynasty. The worship of gods like Amunias and Osiris remained central to Kushite religious life, and the kings and queens of Meroë continued to present themselves as divine rulers, protectors of their people, and mediators between the gods and the earth. The religious institutions in Meroë were powerful and influential, with the priests of Amunias enjoying significant prestige and wealth. The Kushites, however, also maintained certain indigenous religious practices that were uniquely African, blending Egyptian influence with their own traditions in a way that made their culture distinctly Kushite. The reign of the Meroitic kings was characterized by an assertive and ambitious foreign policy. While the kingdom had been driven out of Egypt by the Assyrians, it did not shy away from confronting other powers in the region. The Kushite kings engaged in military campaigns to protect their borders, expand their influence, and ensure the security of their trade routes. The kingdom's military was well-trained and well-equipped, thanks to the wealth generated by trade and the production of iron weapons. The Kushites also maintained a network of alliances with other African kingdoms and peoples, further strengthening their political position and securing their place as a dominant force in the Nile Valley. Despite the growth and prosperity of the Kingdom of Kush, the kingdom's power was not immune to the changing tides of history. As the centuries passed, Kush faced increasing external pressures, both from neighboring African states and from foreign empires. While the Meroitic kingdom remained strong for centuries, its decline began in the 4th century CE. The causes of this decline were multifaceted and included factors such as internal strife, shifting trade patterns, and the rise of new empires. The Kingdom of Aksum, located to the east of Kush, began to emerge as a new power in the region, further challenging the dominance of Kush. Ultimately, the Meroitic kingdom would fall, but not before leaving an indelible mark on the history of Africa and the ancient world. The story of the Kingdom of Kush during the Meroitic period is one of remarkable resilience and cultural achievement. Despite the setbacks and challenges it faced, the Kushites were able to rebuild their kingdom, reassert their cultural identity, and carve out a lasting legacy. Meroë stands as a testament to the strength and ingenuity of the Kushite people, who created a civilization that was both a continuation of Egypt's legacy and a unique expression of African power. The kings and queens of Meroë ensured that the Kingdom of Kush would not be forgotten, and their achievements would echo through history as a reminder of Africa's greatness in the ancient world. As the Kingdom of Kush solidified its new position with the relocation of its capital to Meroë, it entered a period marked by a combination of military ambition, cultural renaissance, and a keen focus on strategic defense. The Kushite rulers of Meroë were determined to ensure that their kingdom would not only survive but thrive, even in the face of changing dynamics in the surrounding regions. Their ability to consolidate power and their focus on trade, resource extraction, and military prowess became central to their continued success. Meroë was positioned to dominate the Nile Valley and much of northeastern Africa, yet its prosperity also made it a target for rival kingdoms and emerging powers. Meroë's geographic location offered both advantages and vulnerabilities. Situated further south from the old capital of Napata, it was somewhat more removed from the immediate reach of Egyptian influence. This strategic positioning allowed the Kushite rulers to build their kingdom in relative isolation, free from the immediate pressures of Egypt, but also placed them in close proximity to the powerful and expanding empires of the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. Trade routes passing through the region made Meroë a thriving center for commerce, connecting the wealth of Africa to the Mediterranean world, but they also attracted the attention of powers like Rome and the growing Kingdom of Aksum. The economy of Kush, already bolstered by its control over key trade routes and its rich deposits of resources like gold, ivory, and timber, began to evolve into one of the most prosperous in the ancient world. The discovery of iron in the region and the establishment of ironworking technologies set the kingdom apart. Kush became famous for its ability to produce high-quality iron goods, including weapons, tools, and agricultural implements. The skilled iron workers of Meroë were among the best in the ancient world, and their products were traded far beyond the borders of Kush. This newfound wealth allowed the kingdom to strengthen its military, fortify its defenses, and expand its influence across the region. The iron industry was particularly important for the Kushites, as it enabled them to build a military capable of defending their borders and asserting dominance over neighboring territories. The kingdom's army, well equipped with iron weapons and armor, became a powerful force that was both feared and respected by its enemies. The military strategy of the Meroitic kings was characterized by a combination of defensive fortifications and aggressive expansion. The Kushites knew the value of controlling key resources and routes, so they extended their reach into surrounding regions, establishing a network of client states and alliances that helped protect the kingdom's interests and its trade routes. The military was not the only aspect of Kushite society that flourished under the reign of the Meroitic kings. The kingdom's religious life continued to play a central role in maintaining social cohesion and reinforcing the authority of the ruler. Just as in previous periods, the kings of Meroë were seen as divine figures, chosen by the gods to rule over the land. The religious symbolism of the pharaohs was adopted and adapted by the Kushite kings, who continued to present themselves as the embodiment of divine power. Temples and shrines dedicated to the gods of Egypt, such as Ammonius and Osiris, were constructed throughout the kingdom, and the ruling family maintained a close relationship with the priesthood, which played an essential role in legitimizing their rule. But the religious life of Meroë was not solely dependent on Egyptian traditions. The Kushites retained and celebrated many of their indigenous religious practices, blending these with the more familiar Egyptian gods and rituals. This fusion of cultures created a unique religious identity for Meroë, one that reflected both the heritage of Egypt and the kingdom's distinctiveness. The cult of Ammonius, for example, remained central to Kushite life, with Meroë becoming home to some of the most significant temples dedicated to the god. However, the Kushites also worshipped their own gods, reflecting the integration of local African traditions with a broader Egyptian religious framework. In addition to religious practices, the kings of Meroë focused on monumental construction projects that symbolized the strength and stability of their reign. One of the most striking features of Meroë was its impressive architectural landscape. The Meroitic pyramids, which were built in large numbers and served as tombs for the royal family, became a hallmark of the kingdom's architectural achievement. These pyramids, though smaller and more sharply pointed than those in Egypt, were a powerful reminder of the Kushites' connections to Egypt's ancient civilization. The construction of these grand structures also served to reinforce the legitimacy of the Kushite kings, as they were seen as the living representatives of the divine order, with their tombs serving as a gateway to the afterlife. Alongside the pyramids, the rulers of Meroë constructed vast palaces, temples, and fortifications, which served both religious and political purposes. The palaces were designed not just as royal residences, but as symbols of the king's power. The temples, in addition to their religious significance, also functioned as centers of authority, where the king's decrees were issued and important state matters were discussed. These structures were often adorned with carvings and inscriptions that celebrated the victories of the kings and the prosperity of the kingdom. The inscriptions, many of which were written in the Meroitic script, recounted the military triumphs of the Kushite rulers and the bounty they had brought to their people. As Meroë grew into a prosperous and powerful state, it also began to take on a more cosmopolitan character. The influx of goods and ideas from other regions, particularly from the Mediterranean, transformed Meroë into a cultural melting pot. The kingdom's rulers maintained close diplomatic relations with other African kingdoms and states, as well as with the Mediterranean powers, including the Romans and the Greeks. The connections between Meroë and the Mediterranean world were particularly evident in trade, where Meroë exported luxury goods like gold and iron, while also importing wine, olive oil, and other items from the West. Despite the kingdom's growing power and prosperity, however, there were cracks beneath the surface. The ever-present threat of invasion from foreign powers, particularly the rising influence of the Roman Empire and the Kingdom of Aksum, loomed large. While the Meroitic kings continued to defend their territory and maintain a strong military presence, the kingdom was not impervious to the forces of change. The shift in trade routes, combined with the growing pressure from external empires, began to undermine the kingdom's ability to maintain its dominance in the region. By the time of the 4th century CE, the Kingdom of Kush faced increasing challenges both internally and externally. The rise of the Aksumite Empire to the east presented a new rival, while Roman influence along the Mediterranean began to shift the balance of power. The once thriving trade routes that had brought prosperity to Meroë began to change, and with it, the kingdom's ability to sustain its military and economic strength began to wane. Despite these challenges, the legacy of Meroë and the Meroitic kingdom would remain a lasting testament to the resilience of the Kushite people. The Kingdom of Kush, though it eventually fell to the pressures of external forces, remained a beacon of African strength, culture, and ingenuity. Its period of prosperity under the Meroitic kings demonstrated not only the kingdom's military might, but also its cultural vibrancy and artistic achievements. The pyramids, temples, and inscriptions of Meroë would stand as lasting monuments to a kingdom that carved its place in history, leaving an indelible mark on the history of Africa and the world. Despite its eventual decline, the Kingdom of Kush remains a powerful symbol of African power and influence, a civilization that rose from the banks of the Nile to stand as one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. As the Kingdom of Kush experienced the prosperity of the Meroitic period, the kingdom found itself at a crossroads. Although Meroë had risen to great heights, the pressures of the surrounding world began to take their toll. By the 4th century CE, the Kingdom of Kush faced several challenges: the shifting political landscape of Africa, changes in the dynamics of trade, and increasing incursions by rival powers. While the kingdom had endured many challenges throughout its long history, this was a critical turning point that would mark the beginning of the end for the once mighty Kushite Empire. The ancient kingdom, once able to stand proudly as a regional power, began to experience internal instability, shifting trade routes, and threats from both neighboring African kingdoms and the distant powers of Rome. The first of these threats came from the rise of the Kingdom of Aksum, a powerful state located in what is now modern-day Ethiopia and Eritrea. The Aksumites have been steadily gaining power in the Red Sea region, and their expansion posed a direct challenge to Kush's dominance. Aksum's control of key trade routes and its growing economic strength made it a formidable competitor for Kush. The Aksumites were also developing advanced military technologies, which allowed them to project power over long distances. The Kingdom of Aksum's influence extended beyond Africa. Its reach into Arabian Peninsula trade routes and its control over much of the Red Sea made it a significant regional player. Kush, for all its military prowess and strategic advantages, found itself in an increasingly precarious position. The Kushite kings had long relied on their military superiority and the wealth generated by trade to maintain their kingdom's power. However, the Aksumite kingdom's rapid rise and its ability to control crucial trade routes now threatened Kush's economic base. As the Aksumites expanded their influence over the Red Sea and beyond, Kush's central position in the ancient trade networks began to wane. The loss of crucial trade routes hurt Kush's economy, leading to the slow but steady erosion of its wealth and power. At the same time, the internal political structure of Kush began to show signs of weakening. The Meroitic kings had long maintained a centralized authority, but the demands of an expanding empire and growing external threats began to stretch the kingdom's resources thin. The ability to control far-flung territories diminished as the kingdom struggled to maintain control over its borders and ensure internal stability. The royal court of Meroë, which had once been a symbol of power and prosperity, became increasingly vulnerable to internal strife and external challenges. The very foundations of the kingdom began to crumble under the strain of economic and military pressure, a problem exacerbated by the growing power of neighboring kingdoms. Though the kingdom was now under pressure, the rulers of Kush still held onto their traditions. They maintained their ties to the religious and cultural practices that had long defined their identity. The Kushite kings continued to see themselves as divine rulers, and they remained committed to the construction of monumental buildings and temples. The royal tombs in Meroë, with their iconic pyramids, stood as a testament to the kingdom's enduring cultural legacy. Despite the growing challenges, the Kushites still regarded themselves as the heirs to an ancient tradition of kingship, one that spanned from the time of Pi and the 25th dynasty of Egypt. The Meroitic rulers were determined to preserve the cultural identity of Kush, but their ability to maintain control over the kingdom was increasingly compromised. As the Aksamites continued to grow in power, they began to assert their influence over Kush's southern territories. This was not only a military challenge, but a cultural and ideological one. The Aksamites, who had developed a unique form of Christianity, sought to expand their religious influence into Kushite lands. Christianity was a new and foreign religion to the Kushites, who had long adhered to a combination of Egyptian and indigenous religious practices. The Aksamite kings sought to spread Christianity along the trade routes, and they began to introduce Christian missionaries to the region. The spread of Christianity would become one of the defining features of the Kingdom of Aksum, but it also posed a threat to the deeply rooted religious traditions of Kush. The Kushite kings, already facing external military pressure, now had to contend with the rise of a new religious and cultural order that threatened to undermine their traditional power base. As the Aksamite Empire pressed forward, the Roman Empire also cast its shadow over the region. Rome, with its sprawling empire and insatiable appetite for wealth and resources, began to cast its gaze toward Africa. The Romans, although geographically distant from Kush, saw the region as an important strategic and economic asset. As the Romans advanced through North Africa, they came into contact with the Kushites, and the potential for trade and conflict grew. The relationship between the Kushites and Romans was complex. While there were opportunities for trade and diplomacy, there were also tensions, as the Romans sought to exert their influence over the Nile Valley and its surrounding regions. Rome's increasing dominance in the Mediterranean meant that the Kushites now faced threats from two powerful and ambitious empires. By the end of the 4th century, the Kingdom of Kush had been squeezed between the competing forces of Aksum and Rome. Though the kingdom still retained significant resources and a strong military, its political power was diminishing. The trade routes that had once been vital to the kingdom's prosperity were now increasingly controlled by its rivals. The Meroitic kings, unable to maintain their hold over both the economic and political landscape, began to retreat into a defensive posture. The once thriving city of Meroë began to lose its luster, and its glory days seemed far behind. The decline of the Kingdom of Kush was not sudden, but rather a slow erosion of its power, marked by a combination of military defeats, economic struggles, and cultural shifts. Despite the weakening of the kingdom, the Meroitic people remained proud of their heritage and their accomplishments. They still looked to the past with reverence, remembering the days when their kingdom had ruled over Egypt and held sway over much of northeastern Africa. The collapse of the Kushite Empire did not erase its cultural legacy. The pyramids of Meroë, the temples, and the royal inscriptions still stand as symbols of the kingdom's once great power and influence. Even as the political structure of the kingdom crumbled, its cultural and artistic achievements endured, serving as a reminder of the strength and resilience of the Kushite civilization. As the centuries passed, the Kingdom of Kush was gradually absorbed into the expanding empires of Aksum and Rome. Yet, the Kushite legacy lived on, particularly in the cultural and religious practices that continued to influence the peoples of the Nile Valley and beyond. While the Kingdom of Kush itself may have faded into history, the impact of its civilization can still be seen today in the monuments, art, and traditions that were passed down through generations. The fall of Kush marks the end of an era, but it also serves as a testament to the enduring power of ancient African civilizations. The story of the Kingdom of Kush is one of rise and fall, of triumph and tragedy, and of a people who once stood at the crossroads of Africa and Egypt, shaping the course of history in ways that would echo long after their kingdom faded from the pages of history. The Kingdom of Kush, through its achievements and its eventual decline, remains one of the most significant civilizations of the ancient world, a civilization that will forever be remembered for its cultural, military, and economic contributions to the history of Africa and the wider world. As the Kingdom of Kush faced the growing dominance of its neighbors and the gradual decline of its own power, a new chapter began to unfold in the region's history. The decline of Kush was not a sudden collapse, but a slow erosion of its once great political and military strength. Despite the loss of Egypt and the growing threats from the Kingdom of Aksum and the Romans, the Kushites continued to resist the forces that sought to subdue them. However, the realities of a changing world were becoming increasingly apparent, and the Kushite kings had to navigate a difficult balance between maintaining their sovereignty and adapting to the shifting geopolitical landscape. One of the most defining features of this period was the increasing fragmentation of the Kushite state. The once unified and powerful kingdom was now divided by internal strife, as local leaders and rival factions began to assert their independence. The central authority of Meroë, which had been the heart of Kushite power for centuries, began to weaken. The system of governance that had once held the kingdom together was now under strain, as the Kushite kings struggled to maintain control over the vast territories of their empire. The once powerful military, which had once expanded the borders of Kush and defended its interests, found itself spread thin, unable to deal with the multiple challenges that now faced the kingdom. In the face of these challenges, the Kushites began to adapt to the new realities of their world. The influence of the Aksumite Empire to the south grew, and the Aksumites increasingly dominated the trade routes that had once been vital to the Kushite economy. The rise of Aksum as a regional power meant that the Kushites could no longer rely on the wealth generated from trade alone. The loss of control over the Red Sea routes and the decline of the caravan trade that had once brought prosperity to Meroë further undermined the economic base of the kingdom. The once great cities of Kush, including Meroë, began to show signs of economic decline. The vast temples and palaces that had once been symbols of Kushite power now stood as relics of a bygone era. Despite these setbacks, the Kushites were not completely defeated. Even as the kingdom's power waned, the Kushite rulers continued to assert their authority, albeit in a more diminished form. The once centralized monarchy of Meroë gave way to a more fragmented system of governance, with local rulers increasingly taking on greater authority. These regional leaders, though still recognizing the king as their sovereign, began to act with greater autonomy. This shift in governance was both a response to external pressures and a reflection of the internal challenges that the kingdom faced. As the centralized power of the kings weakened, the role of local elites became more important, and the social and political landscape of Kush was transformed. Meanwhile, the arrival of new influences in the region began to reshape the cultural and religious life of the Kushites. The Kingdom of Aksum, with its Christianization and its growing connections to the Mediterranean world, exerted a significant cultural influence on the Kushites. As Aksum expanded its territory and influence, it brought with it not only new political structures, but also new religious ideas. Christianity, which had begun to spread in Aksum, slowly made its way into Kushite territory. This marked a significant departure from the traditional religious practices that had long been central to Kushite identity. The Kushites had always blended Egyptian religious traditions with their own indigenous beliefs, creating a unique religious system. The introduction of Christianity, however, began to challenge this syncretic religious identity, as new religious ideas began to compete with the old ways. At the same time, the Roman Empire, though distant, continued to exert pressure on the Kushites. The Romans, ever expanding in their reach, had begun to establish a presence along the northern coast of Africa and in Egypt. Their influence spread through trade, diplomacy, and sometimes conflict, and their eyes were increasingly turned toward the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean. The Romans, with their desire for control over trade routes and strategic territories, began to encroach on Kushite lands. Although the Romans never fully conquered Kush, their presence was felt across the region. The Kushites, who had long maintained a degree of independence, now faced the reality of Roman expansion and the changing dynamics of power in the Mediterranean world. Kush, at this stage in its history, was caught between two powerful forces: the growing Aksumite Empire and the distant but formidable Roman Empire. These external pressures compounded the internal challenges facing the kingdom. The once great military might of Kush, which had once defeated the Egyptians and dominated the Nile Valley, was now stretched thin. The Kushite kings, although still revered as divine rulers, no longer held the same commanding presence they once had. The shifting balance of power in the region meant that the Kushites were now forced to confront the reality of their diminished role in the ancient world. The decline of the Kingdom of Kush also marked the end of an era in the history of Africa. The once powerful kingdom that had once controlled vast swaths of territory and commanded respect for neighboring states was now relegated to the margins of history. The collapse of Kush was not a single event, but rather the culmination of centuries of internal strife, external pressures, and economic decline. The loss of Egypt, the rise of Aksum, and the growing power of Rome had all played their parts in the kingdom's eventual downfall. Yet, even as the kingdom began to fade from the political stage, the legacy of the Kushites continued to endure. The legacy of Kush, though overshadowed by the rise of other powers, lived on in the cultural and religious practices that had shaped the kingdom for centuries. The Kushite kings, with their divine authority and their connection to the gods, had left a lasting imprint on the religious landscape of northeastern Africa. The pyramids of Meroë, though no longer the centers of royal power, remained as symbols of the kingdom's once great strength and influence. The Meroitic script, a written language developed by the Kushites, continued to serve as a link to the past, even as the kingdom itself faded into history. Moreover, the cultural and architectural achievements of the Kushites continued to inspire future generations. The Kushite pyramids, with their distinctive architectural style, became a point of pride for later African civilizations. The religious and cultural practices of the Kushites were preserved, albeit in altered forms, as the region transitioned through the centuries. The historical narrative of the Kingdom of Kush would later be rediscovered by scholars and historians, who would recognize its importance as one of the great civilizations of ancient Africa. In many ways, the fall of the Kingdom of Kush marked the end of the ancient African world as it had been known for centuries. The rise of Aksum, the increasing influence of Christianity, and the spread of Roman power all signified the dawn of a new era in the history of Africa and the Mediterranean. Yet, the story of Kush was far from forgotten. The kingdom's rise and fall, its cultural achievements, and its enduring legacy would continue to shape the history of northeastern Africa for centuries to come. The Kingdom of Kush had been a powerful and influential force in the ancient world, and its legacy,